The storm cracked open the New Mexico sky like a ribcage. Wind lashed against the side of the truck, rocking it, as if trying to shove it off the edge of the gravel pullout. Matteo Yazzi sat behind the wheel, unmoving, hands on his knees, watching the rain carve rivers down the windshield. He hadn't turned the engine on in over 2 hours. Gas cost too much now. Everything did. In the back seat, 2 duffel bags slouched like bodies. His tool belt lay on the floorboard, half buried in fast food wrappers and coffee-stained napkins. The last of his world packed into 45 square feet of metal and plastic. The divorce decree sat folded on the dashboard like a taunt, 3 pages heavy as iron. He'd read it so many times the edges had turned soft. Matteo reached for his phone, checked the time. Midnight. Still no messages. His thumb hovered over Lena's name in the contacts. His daughter hadn't answered his last 2 texts, and he wasn't sure he could take a third silence. He set the phone face down. Somewhere between the storm and the dark, a sob clawed its way up his throat, but he held it back. A Yazzie man could cry in private, but not when someone might be watching, even if that someone was just the wind. The lightning flared again, illuminating the parking lot of the old truck stop. Just 5 months ago, this same lot had been a pit stop between job sites. Now it was home. He hadn't even been able to sleep in back tonight. Something had shifted in his spine last week, age or stress or both, and the pain made lying down feel like dying. He pulled open his phone again, tapped through apps he barely used. Real estate, Craigslist, auctions, salvage forums. Hoping for a miracle he didn't believe in. Then he saw it. Historic ranch property, Dawson Ridge NM, 1+ back taxes. No photos. 1 line of description as is. Remote. Quiet. Structurally unsound. Buyer assumes all risks. Contact Colfax County Recorder. He stared at it. Matteo had grown up in northern New Mexico. He knew Dawson Ridge. Knew the kind of country that could kill a man with silence. But the price, he checked his bank app. 9/12/18. Everything he had left after selling his framing tools, his last trailer, and the busted miter saw he'd used to build his life. The posting listed the back taxes as $8,000. He stared for a long minute, then tapped the contact number. A voice picked up on the second ring. A woman, older, careful. Recorder's office. I'm calling about the ranch listing. Dawson Ridge. The one for $1. A pause. Then you sure know, he said, voice dry. But I'm calling anyway. They sent the paperwork the next morning. Matteo signed it by hand in a UPS store, then wired the money from a terminal that beeped too loudly. By that evening, he had a deed emailed to his inbox. He owned a ranch, or what was left of one. It was 3 days later when he stood in front of Lena's high school in Albuquerque truck, freshly washed, a cooler full of tamales in the back seat. She came out, last phone in hand, hair in a loose bun hoodie over her ears, despite the 80-degree heat. She saw him and sighed without looking up. You're late, she said, opening the door. Traffic, he lied. No one's coming with me, she added. I know. She got in, slammed the door, put in her earbuds and leaned against the window like she wasn't sure who hurt her more, him or the world. They drove 6 hours in silence past empty towns and truck stops with broken signs into the high desert, where the land breathed slow and nothing moved unless the wind told it to. When they turned off the main highway onto a cracked county road, Lena finally spoke. This is where it is. Yeah. God. The ranch sat at the bottom of a dry gulch, surrounded by scrub oak, rusted barbed wire, and wind-blasted cedar. The gate hung half open, one hinge snapped. Beyond it, the land stretched into brittle hills. The house hunched like it was ashamed to be seen, roof sagging, paint long gone, porch slanted and splitting. A collapsed barn leaned like a drunk against the wind. "This is the ugliest place I've ever seen," Lena said. Matteo didn't argue. He parked by the porch and shut off the engine. The silence afterward was a kind of roar. He stepped out, boots crunching gravel and glass. Dust stuck to his skin. Inside the house smelled of mold and heat and something older like time gone sour. The living room held only a broken table and a pile of mouse nests. The walls had peeled down to old insulation. One of the floorboards bent when he stepped on it. "You're gonna fix this?" Lena asked from behind him. "I'm gonna try." She didn't answer. In the back room he found what might have once been a pantry, or a root cellar. A rusted ring in the floor caught his eye. He tugged it. A hatch creaked open, revealing a narrow stairwell dropping into dark. "You've got to be kidding me," Lena muttered. He grabbed his flashlight and descended. The cellar was cooler, musty, packed dirt walls, shelves rotted down to slats. As he swept the light across the floor, something metallic caught the beam. A corner of iron, buried under cobwebs and dust. He knelt, brushed it off. A small lockbox sealed tight. Heavy. The kind that wanted to be forgotten. His hands trembled as he pulled it free. Back upstairs, Lena sat on the porch, arms crossed. Matteo set the box down on a splintered table and stared at it. Rust covered the edges, but the lock still held. He turned it in his hands, heart pounding with something he couldn't name. "Is this place haunted?" Lena asked, almost joking. He didn't answer. Instead, he found an old chisel in the truck bed and pried the box open. Inside, a bundle of old letters tied in string. A leather journal, brittle and yellowed. Photographs faded but clear. A young man in uniform. A woman beside him. And beneath them, neatly folded legal papers with names he didn't know yet, but would. Tomás Aguilar. Matteo whispered the name aloud. Somehow it felt familiar. The wind picked up across the ridge, rattling loose shingles. Matteo looked at the journal. The first entry was dated 1952. Lena leaned closer. "What is it, a man's life?" he said. Maybe something more, and for the first time in months the weight in his chest shifted. Not gone, but moving. The sun dropped below the ridge and the land fell silent again. Matteo opened the journal to the first page. He didn't know what he was about to find, but he couldn't stop now. Some land doesn't forget even when people do. The journal's first page was stained, the ink bleeding around the edges like veins. The handwriting was careful, neat, even graceful, and signed with a looping flourish. Tomás Aguilar, January 1952. Matteo read aloud, the words cracking in his throat like dry timber. The entry spoke of optimism of starting a partnership with a man named Elijah Coleman to build a cattle operation on Dawson Ridge. He wrote about the land, how it looked like nothing to most folks, but felt rich to him. How he believed in hard work, in honesty. Lena stood beside him, arms still crossed, but closer now. "Why would someone hide this?" she asked, her voice lower than before. Matteo turned the page. The next entries were brief. Fencing repairs, truck problems, rain shortages. Then something sharper. Thomas noticed discrepancies in cattle counts. Elijah brushing him off. Unfiled receipts. Conversations that didn't sit right. Something went bad, Matteo murmured. Lena didn't respond, but she didn't leave either. They sat on the floor of the empty living room as the wind rattled the siding. The house smelled like dust and rot, but it felt less empty now, like it had a memory. At some point, Lena pulled one of the photographs from the box. She studied it in silence. A man with dark eyes and thick hair wearing an army uniform stood beside a white woman with soft eyes. They were smiling, standing in front of the same house Matteo and Lena now occupied. Only back then the porch was straight, the shutters painted blue. "This was here?" Lena asked. He nodded. 70 years ago. She looked around slowly, the broken windows, the exposed studs, the sagging ceiling. "It looks like a crime scene." Matteo ran his thumb along the brittle edge of the journal. "Maybe it is." They stayed like that for another hour, the journal open between them, the wind slipping in under the doors. When it got too cold, Lena finally said, "I'll set up in the truck tonight." She grabbed her duffel and climbed into the cab without another word. Matteo made his bed on the floor with a sleeping bag and 2 thrift store blankets. Sleep didn't come. Dawn broke with a hard light that gave everything edges. Matteo stood on the porch, sipping gas station coffee from a tin cup. His back ached, his neck stiff, but something in his chest hummed. A kind of pull. Lena slid out of the truck around 7. She had her hoodie up her face, pale from a bad night's sleep, but her eyes were open and alert. "I need Wi-Fi," she muttered. "We don't have Wi-Fi." She stared at him. "Seriously," he nodded toward the horizon. "The nearest town's 20 miles. I think there's a diner with decent signal." Unbelievable. She stomped back into the truck, slammed the door, and didn't speak for the next 30 minutes. Matteo took the quiet as permission to work. He walked the property, noting what could be salvaged. The fencing was mostly gone. The barn was a skeleton. Some support beams might be reusable if he could brace the frame. The well was capped. He'd have to check the line. Septic God knew. But the bones were here, hidden under rot and silence maybe. But here. He was walking back toward the house when he saw movement near the fence line. A figure. Small, stooped, wrapped in a long coat and scarf that flapped in the wind. Matteo paused. The woman crossed through the open gate without hesitation. "You the one bought this place?" she asked. Her voice was dry, full of gravel and tobacco, but not unkind. Matteo nodded. "Name's Matteo Yazzi, Rosalia Ortega." She extended a hand, fingers bent from age but grip strong. "I live half a mile east. Used to be farther, but the town dried up." He remembered the name from the deeds surrounding property lines. "You knew the last owners." She didn't answer right away. Just looked past him at the house. "Shame what happened here," she said. "Used to be a proud place. Before everything went wrong." "What happened?" Rosalia tilted her head, studying him. "You a man who believes in ghosts, I believe in evidence." "Humph." She squinted toward the root cellar. "You find anything down there yet?" Matteo felt his spine stiffen. "Why, you wouldn't be the first." She adjusted her scarf, eyes suddenly sharp. "Tomas Aguilar lived here. Worked this land with Elijah Coleman. They were partners. Brothers, almost. That's what people said anyway. I read his journal." Her eyes narrowed further. "Still here, then?" He held her gaze. "Yes, ma'am." Rosalia sighed and looked out at the pasture. "Elijah Coleman took everything. Thomas's cattle, his land, even his name in a way. When Thomas disappeared, Elijah claimed he ran off with money. Town believed it. Probably easier that way. You didn't believe it, I knew Thomas." Her voice softened. "He was stubborn, honest. He loved this place. He wouldn't leave without a fight." Matteo felt the wind shift slightly, a colder gust rising up the ridge. Rosalia looked at him again. "You start digging into the past around here, mister. Yazzie, you better be ready for what you'll find. Some folks never wanted the truth out. Some still don't." He nodded slowly. "I understand." "Do you?" she asked. "No," he admitted, "but I'm going to." She gave him a look that hovered between pity and respect. "You got a daughter, don't you, Lena? Then do yourself a favor. Be careful what you drag her into. Some land doesn't forget even when people do. She turned and walked back the way she came, her footsteps slow but steady, never looking back. That night, Lena sat on the porch with the journal in her lap. Mateo didn't say a word, just handed her a plate of tamales and sat beside her in the silence. The stars came out slow, one by one, until the sky looked like broken glass on velvet. Lena flipped a page. "You think this guy Thomas, you think he really died out here?" she asked. "I think something happened that shouldn't have," Mateo said. "And I think whoever buried it wanted to keep it buried." She looked down at the page. Then quietly, "I want to help." He nodded, throat tight. She didn't say more. She didn't have to. The wind stirred the pages of the journal, revealing a line Mateo hadn't read before. "If anything happens to me, know that the truth is hidden where only a seeker would look." He stared at it, the words sinking into his bones. Tomorrow he'd start in the barn, and he wouldn't stop. Not until he knew what really happened here. He called him brother with one hand and robbed him blind with the other. The barn had long since collapsed on one side, the roof sloping inward like a broken wing. Mateo stood just outside the threshold, eyeing the leaning frame and warping timbers. The wind pressed dust through the gaps in the boards, the prairie breathing around him. He'd spent most of the morning clearing brush from the foundation, pulling rusted wire and sage out of the way, stacking debris into neat piles to burn later. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, not exactly. But Tomas Aguilar had left a clue in his journal, something hidden where only a seeker would look, and Mateo was seeking. Inside the barn was a half-lit cathedral of ruin. The far corner had caved entirely, sunlight slashing down in bars across the dirt floor. Old tools lay scattered, half-buried shovels, a rusted pitchfork, a horseshoe that had fused with the earth. Mateo crouched low near the base of the northern wall where the stones were older, larger. He ran his hand along the foundation, tapping gently. Most of it sounded solid, but then thunk. Hollow. He narrowed his eyes. The mortar around 3 stones looked different, paler, less weathered, newer than the others. He brushed away the dirt with his gloves, revealing faint scrape marks along the edges. Someone had pried these stones out before. He wedged the pry bar under the middle one and leaned his weight into it. The stone gave a groan, then shifted. He pulled it free, setting it gently aside. The next 2 came easier. Behind the stones, something wrapped in waxed cloth and sealed with what looked like darkened beeswax lay nestled in a gap carved into the foundation. His hands trembled as he pulled it free. It was a metal tube, maybe 18 inches long, capped at both ends, and surprisingly heavy. He brought it into the light and sat on a stable beam to unwrap it. The cloth peeled back in brittle flakes. Inside the tube, tightly rolled, was a bundle of documents. Mateo unrolled the top sheet carefully. A notarized statement. Dated October 10th, 1953, I, Tomas Aguilar, being of sound mind, make this statement as a matter of legal record. My business partner, Elijah Coleman, has been systematically stealing from our cattle operation for the past 18 months. Mateo kept reading, his stomach clenching tighter with every line. Thomas had laid it all out: fraudulent cattle sales, forged invoices, missing money, names of buyers and ranch hands who might have seen too much, dated entries, dollar amounts, evidence. Should my death or disappearance occur under suspicious circumstances, I ask that Elijah Coleman be investigated thoroughly. I have hidden additional records in multiple locations on this property. The truth is here for those willing to look. It was signed and stamped by a clerk in Santa Fe. Mateo exhaled hard, mouth dry. This wasn't just suspicion. This was Thomas preparing for the worst. He reached into the tube again and found a second sheet, this one a hand-drawn map of the ranch. But it wasn't like the official survey maps. This one marked underground water channels, shaded mineral veins, and specific locations marked private. EC only. In the corner, Thomas had scrawled a note, "True value of the land." Elijah knows, but won't discuss, why Mateo looked back toward the house. He wasn't just rebuilding his life here. He was standing on the grave of someone else's betrayal. Lena was on the porch when he returned, knees pulled up to her chest. Thomas's journal open in her lap. She didn't look up. "I read the next entry," she said. October 11th. "Thomas says he's going to meet Elijah in the morning. Says he's giving him one last chance." Mateo nodded, laying the map and documents carefully on the porch beside her. "I found this in the barn," he said. He wasn't bluffing. She leaned over the map. "What's this, water and mineral rights?" Tomas thought the land was worth more than cattle. He thought Elijah figured that out and wanted it all. Lena frowned. "How much more enough to kill for?" Mateo said quietly. She didn't argue. He showed her the statement, letting her read every word. When she finished, she sat back, blowing air through her lips. "Okay," she said. "So Thomas finds out he's being stolen from confronts. Elijah writes this in case he disappears and then vanishes. And no one questioned it, not out here," Mateo said. "Not when the Coleman family owns half the county." Lena went silent. After a moment, she asked, "Do you think Elijah killed him?" "I think Thomas left this behind because he was afraid Elijah would." She looked at the journal again. "Then why didn't anyone ever find this stuff?" "Because they weren't looking," Mateo said. "Or maybe because they didn't want to." That afternoon, Mateo drove them to the tiny library in Cimarron, a low stucco building with a tin roof that rattled in the wind. Inside, they found an old clerk named Joyce who remembered Tomas Aguilar's name, but offered only a shrug. "People don't talk much about that story," she said. "Colemans have long roots here. Still run the bank, feed store, half the town council." Joyce helped them find newspaper archives, yellowing sheets on microfilm readers. Together, Mateo and Lena scanned issues from late 1953. One short article stood out. "Local rancher missing, October 15, 1953. Tomas Aguilar, co-owner of Aguilar Coleman Cattle Coop, was reported missing earlier this week. Sheriff Hector Lujan says there is no evidence of foul play. Partner Elijah Coleman stated Aguilar left town unexpectedly after disagreements regarding business finances. No further investigation is planned at this time." "That's it?" Lena asked. Mateo nodded slowly. "That's all they needed." Lena shook her head. "This isn't just sketchy. This is murder." Back at the ranch, the sun was setting, lighting the prairie in copper and fire. The barn cast long shadows across the field. Mateo walked the edge of the foundation again, thinking. The truth was buried. But not well enough. He sat on the porch with the journal and stared out at the horizon. Lena sat beside him, chin resting on her knees. "You think someone else knows?" she asked. "I think someone helped cover it up." The wind picked up again, a colder gust this time. Lena looked toward the fence line. "Then we should talk to the people who were here. Someone's got to remember." Mateo thought of the woman from earlier, Rosalia Ortega, and her worn-out warning. "Some land doesn't forget." "She might," he said. "She knew Thomas. She's still here." Lena pulled the map into her lap, studying it. "Then we find everything he left. All of it." He looked over at her. The girl who hadn't spoken to him for weeks now sat beside him with fire in her eyes. "We will," he said. Behind them, the house groaned in the wind like it was waking up. You start digging out here, Mr. Yazzie. You better be ready for what you'll find. The road to Rosalia Ortega's house was more of a memory than a path. Faded tire ruts between Pinon and Cedar, the kind you only noticed if you already knew where they led. Mateo guided the truck through the brush, slowly windshield wipers pushing dust instead of rain. Lena sat beside him, still gripping Tomas Aguilar's journal in her lap, like it might vanish if she blinked. She hadn't said much since breakfast, but she kept turning the same page over and over, her thumb rubbing the corner raw. The house came into view, a squat adobe structure with a green tin roof and a sagging porch. Wind chimes danced softly in the breeze. An old cottonwood tree stretched out beside it, branches gnarled like reaching fingers. Rosalia was already on the porch, sitting in a wooden rocker, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders despite the warmth. Her gaze met Mateo's as he pulled up steady and sharp, like she'd been expecting him all morning. Lena hung back as Mateo approached. "I figured you'd come back," Rosalia said. "That look you had, same one he had when he found out the land wasn't just dirt." Mateo took off his hat. "You were close to him. Tomas." She leaned forward, hands clasped around a mug. "I was supposed to marry him." The wind paused like it was listening. She nodded toward the other chair. "Sit down. But I won't lie to you. Some stories out here, they don't end the way you want." Mateo lowered himself into the creaking chair. Lena hovered by the truck watching. "He left behind a lot," Mateo said. "Letters, documents. He knew Elijah was stealing from him." Rosalia didn't flinch. "I knew." "You knew I knew enough," she said. But women in 1953 didn't get much say. Not out here. When Thomas vanished, they said he ran off with another woman, that he gambled the money away, that he was drunk or angry or worse. And folks believed it because Elijah told them to. Mateo clenched his jaw. "But you didn't." "No," she said softly, "because he left the ring with me." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small velvet pouch worn thin at the edges. Inside was a tarnished silver ring inset with a square-cut turquoise stone. Simple but made with care. "He never gave it to me," she said, eyes distant. "He was going to. He was waiting for things to settle once the season was over, once he fixed what was broken with Elijah. He thought it could be fixed. He was wrong." Mateo glanced toward the truck. Lena had stepped closer now, journal in her hands. "Your daughter can come up," Rosalia called without turning. "This ain't a ghost story. It's a truth story." Lena joined them slowly, keeping a careful distance but listening intently. Rosalia looked at her with a kind of quiet understanding. "You look like you ask a lot of questions. Only when the adults lie," Lena replied. Rosalia let out a low laugh. "Then you're in the right place." They sat for a long while in the early afternoon sun, listening to Rosalia piece together the slow unraveling of Tomas Aguilar's final months. She spoke of cattle going missing, conversations behind closed doors, Elijah Coleman's rising wealth and influence. He started building up that company of his, she said. Coleman Land and Water. At first it was just side money leasing parcels. Then he started sealing wells, capping springs. Said it was for preservation, but no one ever got to use that water again unless they paid him. "Monopolizing water?" Mateo asked. She nodded, and Tomas figured it out. "The map he drew, he showed me part of it once. Said there was more under this land than anyone realized. And that Elijah had known for years." Mateo exchanged a glance with Lena. "Do you know where he kept the rest of the records?" Lena asked. "No," Rosalia said, "but I know who might." She reached behind her chair and pulled out a worn leather notebook. Inside was a name written in faded ink, Luis Tapia. Luis worked the ranch with them. Quiet man. Loyal. He disappeared right after Thomas did. I heard later he moved to Tucumcari, ended up in a care home. Had a fall. Doesn't speak much anymore. Mateo took the notebook, careful not to smudge the paper. If he saw something, he did, Rosalia said. Or he wouldn't have run. The chimes clinked softly in the breeze. She stood slowly, bones stiff, and looked down the hill toward the valley. You start digging out here, Mr. Yazzie. You better be ready for what you'll find, she said. Because Elijah Coleman didn't build his empire on luck. And people still loyal to him, they'll bury the truth again if they can. Mateo stood with her. We're not going away. I believe you, she said. Which is why I need you to be smart. You think the Colemans forgot about this land, about what's buried here? Lena looked up sharply. Do you mean buried literally? Rosalia didn't answer. Just stared out at the distant hills. Mateo reached into his back pocket and unfolded the hand-drawn map. Did Thomas ever mention anything about a well, something near the barn? She narrowed her eyes, thinking. Yes. There was an old well just past the back paddock. Elijah said it went dry and had it sealed, but Thomas didn't believe that. He said the water changed, not vanished. Mateo circled a point on the map. That was where he'd look next. As they walked back to the truck, Rosalia called after them. One more thing, they turned. If you really want the truth, don't just follow Thomas's trail, she said. Follow the money, the water, the things men kill for when land looks worthless. She turned and went back to her chair, the screen door creaking behind her. Inside the cab, Lena stared out the window, quiet, for a long time. He loved her, she said finally. Yeah. And she waited 70 years for someone to ask her the right questions. Mateo didn't say anything. He started the engine, turned the truck toward the ridge, and drove. Dust rose behind them in curling ghosts. As they passed the rusted gate back onto their property, Lena pointed toward the far edge near the collapsed barn. What's that? She asked. Mateo squinted. A mound of earth. A shape barely visible beneath bramble and brush. A concrete cap. That, he said, heart rising in his chest, looks like a well. When a man hides something in stone, he doesn't plan on coming back for it. The wind scraped dry branches across the concrete slab, like fingernails across a coffin lid. Mateo stood over the old well boots, planted in the dirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. A line of scrub brush had tried to reclaim the mound over the years, but the circular shape underneath was unmistakable flat poured concrete that didn't match anything else on the property. Lena crouched beside it, hands on her knees, breathing through her mouth to fight the smell of damp earth and rust. The sunlight caught in the broken weeds around them, painting their shadows long and strange. There's a company name etched in the edge, she said, running her finger along the rim. Coleman Construction, dated 1953. Mateo's stomach turned. The year Thomas disappeared, he knelt and tapped the slab, solid, thick, too clean for something poured just to seal a dry well. This wasn't maintenance, it was burial. You think they used this to dump? Lena started, then stopped. I think it's no coincidence this was poured right after Thomas vanished, Mateo said. He looked over the land, empty hills, a few rotted fence posts, nothing moving but wind. Still, he felt like he was being watched. They circled the slab. No bolts, no hatch, just a flat cover sealed flush with the ground. No one had intended for this to be opened again. Lena sat back on her heels. We need ground-penetrating radar or something. Mateo shook his head. We don't have time for expensive equipment. So what do we do? Dig it up, Mateo didn't answer. He brushed the dirt away from the edge and studied the texture of the pour. Whoever sealed this had known what they were doing. This wasn't a farmer's patch job. It was clean level, reinforced, like a vault, a coffin without a name. Later that afternoon, Mateo returned with a borrowed sledgehammer from a neighbor down the road. Lena stayed in the truck with the journal and her earbuds keeping lookout. She didn't like it, and he didn't blame her. Something about the way the sun hung too low too early made everything feel sideways. He took a breath and brought the hammer down. The crack echoed through the valley like a shot. Dust bloomed, concrete splintered but not much. Whoever had poured this hadn't spared material. 3 more swings. A fracture spidered across the surface. Another. Sweat ran into Mateo's eyes. His arms ached by the 5th blow. He paused, leaning on the handle. Then he saw it. A hairline split curling toward the center. Deeper than the rest. He hit it again, this time focused, driving the head down with every bit of weight in his frame. With the 8th strike, a corner chunked free, and below it, darkness. A hollow sound that told him everything. It wasn't dry. The well was still open. They didn't speak much that night. Mateo sat at the kitchen counter, staring at the broken pieces of concrete he'd brought up like evidence. Lena sat on the floor with the map spread beside her, tracing routes between the house and outbuildings. "I don't think Thomas was just hiding things from Elijah," she said. "I think he was documenting it in case he got killed." "He knew the land had value," Mateo replied. "And he knew what Elijah would do to protect it." "But why didn't anyone believe Rosalia or look into this?" "Because Elijah Coleman made sure no one did." Lena nodded. "And his grandson still owns the rights." Mateo felt his chest tighten. Austin Coleman. She looked up. "You think he knows? If he doesn't, he's about to." The next morning, Mateo called a woman named Rebecca Chen, a land use attorney based in Santa Fe. He'd worked with her years ago on a zoning appeal. She was sharp, skeptical, and unafraid of big names. He sent her scans of the notarized statement, the mineral rights map, and a photo of the well slab with the company logo. She called back within the hour. "I've seen a lot of land disputes," she said. "But this is fraud, concealment, and maybe even homicide. You think it's enough to open an investigation?" "It's enough to scare people," she replied. "Especially the people sitting on stolen assets." She asked if the property had been surveyed recently. Mateo told her no, just what he'd uncovered by hand. "I'll pull the original deed records," she said. "Don't talk to anyone until I call you back." He hung up and turned to Lena, who was already lacing her boots. "Where are you going?" he asked. "To get the rest of the journal out of the cellar," she said. "If Thomas hid part of it, maybe there's more." She was gone 15 minutes before Mateo realized how quiet it had gotten. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive stillness. He stepped onto the porch and saw the dust trail rising along the main road. A black SUV was pulling into the drive, tires crunching slow and deliberate over gravel. He didn't move. The SUV stopped 10 feet from the porch. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. Mid-30s, clean boots, crisp jeans, a starched shirt. Tan like money that spends time outside. His smile was polite. Empty. "Mr. Yazzie," he said. "Heard you bought the old Aguilar place." Mateo stayed silent. The man extended his hand. "Austin Coleman." Of course he was. Mateo nodded, once didn't shake. "Mind if I ask what your plans are out here?" Austin said, eyes scanning the house behind him. "We've got interest in some of the adjacent parcels. Wouldn't want to have any conflicts. We're rebuilding." Austin tilted his head. "I see." You and your daughter Mateo's jaw tightened. "Good to know," Austin added smoothly. "Well, if you run into any issues, water access, grazing disputes, I'd be happy to help. We like to keep things clean out here." Mateo stared at him. "Did your grandfather pour that slab out by the barn?" Austin's smile didn't waver. Couldn't say. That was before my time. I found your company's name on it. Austin took a step forward. You know, it's funny. Every time someone tries to stir up old ghosts, this land bites back. Happened before. Might happen again. Mateo didn't blink. Austin slid his sunglasses on. Anyway, welcome to Dawson Ridge. He got back into the SUV and reversed down the road, his taillights blinking like an afterthought. Lena returned 5 minutes later, backpack slung over one shoulder. Who was that trouble? Mateo said. But we've got more of Thomas's journal now. And Rebecca's digging into the legal side. Lena opened her bag and pulled out 2 new items, a folded stack of handwritten notes and a small cloth bundle. This was in the crawl space, she said. Behind the bricks. I almost missed it. Inside the bundle, another photograph, Thomas standing beside the well before it was sealed, and a silver pocket watch engraved on the back, TA to EC, brothers not blood. Mateo ran a finger over the inscription. When a man hides something in stone, he said quietly, he doesn't plan on coming back for it. And sometimes when he doesn't come back, it's because someone made damn sure he couldn't. Truth don't rot even if the man who spoke it's been dead a long time. Luis Tapia sat slouched in a faded armchair, arms limp at his sides, as if gravity had slowly been winning for decades. The room smelled of menthol ointment and dust with sunlight slanting through half-drawn blinds. He didn't turn his head when Mateo and Lena walked in, but his eyes tracked them sharp, cautious, like an old dog that hadn't forgotten the bite of a bad hand. Senor Tapia, Mateo asked, removing his hat. Luis didn't answer. The nurse at the door smiled thinly. Sometimes he talks, sometimes he doesn't. But he listens, and he remembers. She left them alone. Lena glanced around the room. A small table held an old transistor radio, a cracked ceramic cup, and a Bible with a rosary tucked inside. Nothing else suggested anyone had visited in years. Mateo stepped closer. We came about Tomas Aguilar. Still nothing. Mateo placed the photograph on Luis's lap, the one Tomas took by the well. Luis's fingers didn't move, but his eyes locked onto the image. Lena crouched beside him. You were there, weren't you? When it happened. A flicker. His lower jaw shifted barely. Mateo pulled the pocket watch from his coat pocket and placed it beside the photo. We're not here to cause trouble, but we found part of the truth, and we think you're one of the only people left who knows the rest. Luis blinked. Once. Then his lips moved. No one wanted to listen back. Then he said, voice dry as gravel. Not when the man with the money did all the talking. Mateo leaned forward. What happened? Luis stared at the photograph. They were brothers until they weren't. Elijah, he couldn't stand that Tomas had the land. Said it out loud one night when he'd had too much. Called him a squatter, a lucky wetback with a deed. Thomas laughed. Shouldn't have. Lena sat still, holding her breath. Luis's words came slow, broken, like brittle branches. It was over water. Always was. Thomas found springs under the North Ridge. Wanted to drill share it with neighbors. Elijah said no. Said the value wasn't in cattle, it was in what ran underground. Luis coughed a dry bark. Mateo handed him a paper cup of water. He sipped, then kept going. The day Thomas disappeared, he told me to stay home. Said he was going to meet Elijah one last time. Clear the air. His voice dropped lower. That night, Elijah showed up alone. With 2 men I didn't know. Told me Thomas skipped town. But he never came back for his truck. Never picked up his wages. Left everything behind. He nodded toward the watch. That was on his nightstand the morning he left. Mateo asked, Why didn't you go to the sheriff? Luis's mouth twisted. Sheriff Lujan. He played poker with Elijah every Thursday. Got himself a new patrol car 2 days after Thomas vanished. Lena's hands curled into fists, so they all knew, or chose not to care. Luis nodded slowly. There's a box, he said, back in the cabin. I kept it hidden after they came sniffing. Who Elijah's men? They tore the place apart. But I'd already moved it. Where is it now? Mateo asked. Luis's eyes drifted to the ceiling. Cabins on trust land now, abandoned, east side of the ridge, inside the chimney. Mateo pulled out his phone, opened the map from Tomas's journal. Here, Luis nodded once. Why tell us now? Lena asked quietly. Luis didn't look at her, just whispered, because truth don't rot even if the man who spoke it's been dead a long time. They found the cabin just past noon. The roof had caved in, the door hung from one hinge. It was nothing more than a shadow of what it once was, charred in places half swallowed by juniper. A dry creek bed ran behind it littered with tin cans and rusted fencing. Inside, the air was still. Mateo stepped over fallen beams and broken glass. The fireplace sat in the back corner built from river stone, the mortar crumbling in places. Lena grabbed a flashlight and crouched beside it. You think it's still here if Luis hid it behind the flue stones, maybe? Mateo ran his hands along the interior wall of the chimney, knocking gently. Hollow. He pried one stone loose with a crowbar, careful not to let it fall. Behind it, wrapped in canvas, was a small metal box sealed with wire. He held it up. It weighed more than it looked. Lena grinned. We're getting good at this. They opened it on the hood of the truck. Inside were ledgers, handwritten pages documenting cattle sales invoices, notes on mineral test results. At the bottom, a folded letter addressed to Rosalia Ortega. Mateo opened it and read aloud. Rosie, if you're reading this, I didn't make it. I trusted Elijah too long. But I've left the truth where it can be found. I just hope someone's willing to pick it up. Mateo swallowed hard. The signature was simple, Thomas. Lena stared at the box, then at her father. This is enough, right, to go public. It's more than enough, he said. He turned to look back down the trail, and stopped. Tire tracks. Fresh. They hadn't been there when they arrived. Get in the truck, he said. Lena didn't argue. They were halfway back to the main road when the black SUV appeared again this time, parked sideways across the exit path. Austin Coleman leaned against the driver's side, arms, folded, expression unreadable. Mateo slowed, but didn't stop. Austin raised a hand like they were old friends. Then he looked down at the box in Mateo's passenger seat. What did I say about stirring up old ghosts? He called out. Mateo didn't respond. You're poking at something that don't need waking, Austin said. It's already awake, Mateo replied. Austin's smile thinned. That's a shame. Could have worked something out. But you just made this very expensive for both of us. Mateo eased the truck forward. You'd be surprised what the land can forget, Austin said. Mateo drove past him without another word, dust kicking up behind them. But neither of them noticed the figure watching from the hill, above the one with a camera slung over one shoulder and a notepad full of questions. Her name was Teresa Lucero, and she was about to make the story public. Some stories don't need a hero, they just need someone stubborn enough not to quit. The diner in Cimarron hadn't changed since the 80s, linoleum floors, scuffed, thin, faded menu boards with half-lit bulbs and a jukebox that played nothing newer than Patsy Cline. Teresa Lucero stirred her coffee slowly, watching the screen of her recorder like it might blink out the truth by itself. Across from her, Mateo sat, stiff eyes flicking toward the window every time a truck passed outside. Lena sat beside him, arms crossed, a little too still. Teresa leaned back. What you've got is big, and it's not just about a missing rancher. It's about stolen land water rights and a family that's run this county like a private kingdom for 70 years. Mateo nodded, but didn't speak. Teresa narrowed her eyes. You sure you want this public? Because once I run this story, you don't get to shut it back in the box. It'll put a target on your back. We already got one, Lena said flatly. Teresa looked at her. And you, Lena lifted her chin. He's not doing it alone. Teresa tapped her recorder, leaned forward. Tell me everything. Start with the well. By the time Mateo finished recounting the documents, the forged records, the photo, and the sealed well, Teresa's fingers were flying across her notebook. She asked sharp, fast questions. Who notarized the statements? What date the construction seal was poured? How many others might have been complicit? You know, she said, if you had half this story but no proof, I couldn't touch it. But this, it's layered. There's a pattern. She pulled out a file from her leather satchel. 2 years ago, another family up near Eagle Nest tried to drill a private well. Austin Coleman's company blocked it, citing environmental regulation. Same thing happened in Mora, then again outside Wagon Mound. She slid the file across the table. I think the Colemans have been controlling access to groundwater across the whole county for decades. Quietly, strategically. And the only person who saw it before it started was Tomas Aguilar. Mateo flipped through the reports. Same signatures, same permits, same pattern of land seizure and silence. He tried to stop it, Mateo said. Teresa nodded and paid for it. She stood, pulling her bag over one shoulder. I'll write it. All of it. I've got connections with a few outlets in Santa Fe and Albuquerque. If I frame it right, property fraud, historical injustice, land theft tied to racial bias, it won't just run, it'll stick. Mateo watched her carefully. You don't sound surprised. I've been waiting to nail the Colemans for years, she said. But everyone I talked to either backed off or disappeared. Lena asked, what about Rosalia? Will you include her? I want her story too, Teresa said. People forget women like her kept this place going, all while being ignored. They walked outside together, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun. You two got somewhere safe to stay? Teresa asked. Mateo hesitated. The ranch. She raised a brow. You sure that's wise? It's our land now. I'm not giving it back. Teresa nodded slowly. I'll have a draft in 2 days. I'll call before it goes live. She slid her card into Mateo's hand and drove off without fanfare, dust curling up behind her like a promise. Back at the ranch, the mood was quiet. The wind had picked up, scraping against the side of the house. Lena sat on the porch steps, elbows on her knees, eyes distant. You think it's enough? She asked. What we found, Mateo lowered himself onto the step beside her. It's the truth. That's what matters. She shook her head. Truth doesn't always win, no, he said, but lies don't last forever. She looked up at him. You always believed that he thought for a moment, then answered honestly. No. But I believe it now. Lena exhaled. Feels like we're waiting for a storm. We are. The sun was dipping low when the phone rang. Rebecca Chen's voice was tight, urgent. I don't know what you've done, but I just got a call from the State Water Commission. They're reopening old permits connected to Coleman Land and Water, starting with Dawson Ridge. Mateo straightened. Already Teresa must have tipped someone. And your documents, those notarized statements, the mineral survey, they triggered a full review. He looked out at the field, at the cracked earth and forgotten fence posts. What happens now? Rebecca's tone sharpened. Now they dig. Literally. And if they find any evidence that Elijah Coleman sealed a functioning water source or worse, buried something criminal, you're sitting on a powder keg. You need to be prepared. I am, Mateo said. So's my daughter. There was a pause on the line. She's a good one, Rebecca said. Better than me, he replied quietly. When he hung up, he saw Lena was already watching. Something's coming, huh? He nodded. Yeah, she stood. Then let's get ready. They walked the land together past the barn toward the broken fence line, the well, and the marked places on Thomas's map. Places that hadn't mattered to anyone in decades. Places where truth waited slow but steady like water beneath stone. As they rounded the back pasture, a truck appeared on the ridge. Not black this time, white government issued. 2 men stepped out. Clipboards, cameras, surveyors, Mateo muttered. State Commission. Lena didn't flinch. Let them in. One of the men approached. You the property owner, yes, Mateo said. Mateo Yazzie. We're under directive from Santa Fe to begin an assessment of sealed groundwater access points related to the Coleman holdings. Your well's on the list. He held up a form. You might want to stay clear, the other added. If this thing hasn't been opened since '53, what's under there could be dangerous. Mateo glanced at Lena. Go ahead, he said. The men went to work, cutting away brush, setting up equipment, measuring soil compaction. One started taking samples. The other photographed the cracked slab. Then came the sound metal against stone. A hollow knock. A murmur of surprise. We've got depth, one of them said. Then the crowbar, again concrete cracking. A breeze like cool breath rising up from below. The man looked at Mateo, serious now. We're going to need backup. Maybe the sheriff. Maybe a forensic unit. Why, Lena asked. He pointed at the broken seam. There's something down there. Something that was never supposed to be found. Mateo felt it in his chest before he knew what it meant. Tomas hadn't just documented truth. He'd buried it. And now it was clawing its way back into the light. Lena's voice was a whisper. You think it's him? Mateo looked out at the hills, the wind curling over the ridge like breath over old bones. I think it's time we find out. Some men build fences to keep things out. Others build them to keep secrets buried. The sheriff's truck rolled in just after sundown, headlights throwing long shadows across the broken pasture. Mateo stood with his arms crossed, flanked by Lena and the state surveyors. The wind had died down, but the silence in its place felt heavier. Sheriff Clay Marrow stepped out, boots crunching against dry dirt. He was tall, worn at the edges, with a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. A Coleman man for most of his career, but one who played quiet, not loud. The kind that never got his hands dirty, but always seemed to know where the mess was. You the ones called this in? He asked, eyeing the cracked well slab. Mateo nodded. State Water Commission's on site. They broke it open. Marrow adjusted his belt, walked over to the edge, and peered inside. One of the surveyors was crouched beside the opening, holding a flashlight in one hand and a probe in the other. What did you find? The man looked up. Unsealed depth, possibly 20 feet. Organic remains caught in the silt. Human size. No decomposition pattern like animal bones. Marrow's jaw moved once, a tick in his cheek. You sure enough to call the medical examiner, the man replied. This is a body dump. A sealed one. Marrow turned to Mateo. And you say this was poured by Elijah Coleman? Mateo pointed to the etched date and company stamp. His construction firm. 1953, right after Thomas Aguilar went missing. Marrow looked long and hard at the mark, then stepped back. We'll treat this as a crime scene until proven otherwise. You got somewhere else to stay tonight. This is our land, Mateo said. I'm not kicking you off it, Marrow replied, but it's going to get crowded here come morning. He turned to the surveyors. Flag it. No more digging until the ME gets here. Then to Mateo again. And you don't leave town. Mateo's face didn't move. Wasn't planning to. The sheriff walked off, but not before giving one last glance at the cracked slab as if it were whispering things he didn't want to hear. Back inside the house, Lena paced the kitchen floor, arms tight around her chest. The lights flickered once, then steadied. Mateo leaned against the counter, hands dirty from the day's digging, shoulders heavy. If that's Tomas, she said, this changes everything. It already has, Mateo said. Lena stopped. You think the sheriff's going to help us or bury it again? Mateo shook his head. He won't bury it. Not now. Not with the state involved. And the Colemans, they'll feel it. Even if they act like they don't. Lena stared at the floor. He was a good man, wasn't he, Tomas? Yeah. Mateo's voice softened. Yeah, he was. She moved to the table where the box from Luis Tapia's cabin still sat open. She pulled out one of the ledgers again, flipped to a page with red ink scrawled across the top, unauthorized withdrawal. This ledger shows missing cattle, diverted water, changed maps. It's all here. And now, a body. Mateo exhaled. They can't ignore it anymore. The next morning, 2 unmarked vans, a coroner's vehicle, and a forensic tent were set up over the well. Officials moved like clockwork, snapping photos, marking grid lines, lowering equipment into the shaft. A female examiner in surgical gloves pulled out the first bone-long, weathered, discolored by decades underground. We'll need DNA, she said. But the position matches a hasty burial, arms crossed over the chest, boots still on. She looked at Mateo. Was your man wearing boots? He nodded. Always. By midday, the news had spread. Trucks began slowing near the property line. Teresa Lucero returned with a camera crew from Santa Fe, and by noon, the first article hit the wire. Cold case break, remains found on former Aguilar Ranch in Dawson Ridge. Coleman's name wasn't in the headline, but it was buried 3 paragraphs down, along with quotes from the surveyor, the sheriff, and a single chilling sentence. Historical records suggest the well was sealed by a company owned by Elijah Coleman in late 1953, shortly after Aguilar's disappearance. Mateo and Lena sat on the porch as the wind returned hot and restless. A truck pulled up. Not the sheriff this time. Austin Coleman. He stepped out without waiting for an invitation, wearing a suit that looked too clean for the dirt he stood on. His mouth twitched as he looked toward the crowd gathering past the fence line. Congratulations, he said. You got your headlines. Mateo stood slowly. You come to confess? Austin smirked. I came to remind you this won't end the way you think. Lena stepped up beside her father. It already is. Austin looked at her, really looked, and something flickered behind his eyes. You're making enemies you can't see, he said. Mateo didn't flinch. You're not invisible anymore. Austin glanced at the tents, the surveyors, the cameras. I hope you enjoy the circus, he said, turning to leave. Just remember who owns the tent. They watched his truck disappear into the dust. Lena crossed her arms. Coward. No, Mateo said. Cowards hide. He's here because he's scared. She looked at him. Scared of what? Truth? Proof, consequences. She nodded slowly, then pointed down the road. You think they'll find more? I think they'll find what we're meant to see. He stepped back inside and picked up the last envelope from the box. It was yellowed and sealed with wax. On the front, a name in Thomas's handwriting, for the one who stays. Inside was a final letter. A farewell. If this land ever speaks again, let it speak in my name. Let it tell what was taken and who took it. I leave it not for revenge, but for justice, the kind that takes root slow but never dies. Mateo folded the letter carefully. Lena was standing in the doorway watching him. What did it say? He held it up. That this place is finally talking again, and neither of them had any plans to stop listening. They always think the land forgets, but it holds everything, every lie, every boot print, every drop of blood. The earth at Dawson Ridge had split open like a mouth learning to speak after 70 years of silence. Beneath the collapsed slab, they'd pulled up the rest of the remains bones, weathered by time fragments of clothing, a belt buckle with the initials TA, and a cracked horseshoe pin still tarnished, but whole. The body was Tomas Aguilar's. DNA from Rosalia confirmed it. The tests made it official, but everyone already knew. Mateo sat at the kitchen table with a stack of papers spread in front of him, the ledgers, the journal notarized statements, Luis's confession, and the forensic report from the coroner. Each one a piece of a puzzle no one had dared touch before. Now it was laid bare. Lena sat across from him, tracing the edge of a photo, the one of Tomas standing in front of the well, unaware he was posing in front of his own grave. The door knocked once. Rebecca Chen stepped inside, brushing dust off her jacket, eyes sharp. She set her briefcase down and opened it. "They're pressing charges," she said. "Not just against Austin. The DA's filing conspiracy to defraud against Coleman Land and Water. Criminal negligence. Potential homicide if they can tie Elijah to the act. They've reopened the books." Mateo didn't speak. He just nodded slowly. Rebecca handed him a document. "This is a court motion, filed 2 hours ago. If it goes through, the water rights Elijah seized, all of them will be frozen, including the rights the Colemans built their empire on." Lena leaned in. "All of them, every parcel tied to the fraudulent well closures," Rebecca said. "We're talking millions in lost revenue." Mateo looked out the window toward the ridgeline. The same view Thomas must have looked at every day. Sunlight on red clay, the hush of desert wind. "They're gonna come at us hard," he said. "I know," Rebecca replied, "which is why I came here instead of calling. There's something else." She opened her file again and pulled out a deed. It was stamped and certified. "The mineral rights beneath your land, the ones Thomas mapped, they're real. And because you bought the property legally, they belong to you now." Lena blinked. "Wait. You mean oil, gas, groundwater, it's all yours," Rebecca confirmed. "The Colemans spent decades trying to bury that information. But Thomas didn't just find it, he proved it." Mateo's jaw worked as he stared at the document. "They killed him for this," he said quietly. "And now it's yours," Rebecca said. "That's what scares them most." By late afternoon, reporters had returned. Cameras, satellite vans, microphones shoved at the fence line. Teresa Lucero was in the center of it all, holding up Thomas's journal for a second feature piece she was calling The Land That Remembers. She spoke directly into the camera, her voice clear and deliberate. "This isn't just about a murder. It's about theft of land, of life, of legacy. One family tried to silence a man who stood in their way. Now, 70 years later, his truth is speaking louder than ever." Austin Coleman watched from inside his office, jaw clenched, as the feed streamed live on a flat-screen TV. Behind him, his lawyer paced. "We can try to freeze the assets, stall the court orders. But if they prove your grandfather was involved in a cover-up, he was smart," Austin snapped. "He left nothing traceable." "You're sure?" Austin didn't answer. He was remembering a night years ago when his grandfather sat him down by the fire and told him, "Never build on what's yours. Build on what they think is theirs, and you'll never have to fight fair." But now that lie was bleeding out into the open. At the ranch, a letter arrived by courier. Mateo opened it at the porch table. It was addressed from the Office of Historical Preservation. Inside was a formal notice the Aguilar Ranch, due to its relevance in the recent investigation, was being considered for protective status as a historical site. Lena read it twice, eyes wide. They want to preserve it, they want to protect it, Mateo said. And us. That's a different fight. She picked up Tomas's ring, still resting in the velvet pouch Rosalia had given them, and slipped it onto her finger for a moment. It was too big, but she held it there anyway. He didn't die for nothing, she said. No, Mateo replied. But we're the ones who have to live like it meant something. That night, a coyote screamed out on the ridge. Lena stood in the doorway, eyes scanning the tree line. It felt like the land had finally exhaled, but the air was still tense. Mateo joined her, mug in hand. What happens if they come after us? She asked. They already have, he said, but they're losing ground. She looked up. You afraid always, he said. But we don't move. Not this time. She nodded. A second car pulled up Rebecca again, this time with 2 state agents in plain clothes. There's one more thing, she said, stepping out. We need you both to testify, where Mateo asked. Public hearing? Water Commission review? Then a grand jury. Lena stepped forward. You want us to stand in front of them, I want you to make them listen, Rebecca said. To everything. Mateo looked at the field beyond the porch, the well now covered with caution tape and survey markers. Tomas's grave, his voice in paper and ink. We'll speak, he said. Rebecca nodded. Good. Because you're not just witnesses now. You're the ones carrying this. Lena turned to Mateo. Then we tell it all. And they would. Because the land had held the truth for 70 years. And now it was time for the world to hear it. A courtroom ain't built for justice. It's built for records. Justice lives in the courage it takes to speak when no one wants to hear. The courthouse in Las Vegas, New Mexico, was older than most of the people who filled it. Worn wooden benches lined the gallery, and the ceiling fans turned with slow, creaking resistance. It smelled like floor polish and nerves. Mateo adjusted his collar, his shirt stiff with starch. Lena sat beside him, hands tucked under her thighs, trying to still their shaking. She wore her mother's turquoise earrings and a plain black jacket. Her eyes didn't move from the front of the room. Across the aisle, Austin Coleman sat behind his attorneys, flanked by 2 other men in matching gray suits, company board members, Rebecca had said. He didn't look at the Yazzies. He didn't need to. His presence was loud enough without it. Rebecca leaned in. They're going to try to stall the hearing. Delay it on procedural grounds. That's the Coleman strategy. Buy time, bleed money, wait for attention to fade. Mateo shook his head. They can stall all they want. We're not going anywhere. The judge entered, an older woman with silver hair pulled tight and eyes that missed nothing. The room stood, then settled. A clerk read the charges, the accusations, the history concealed remains forged, deeds blocked access to state water reserves, and systematic seizure of private land under false environmental claims. Then it was time for the testimonies. Mateo was called first. He stood, hands trembling slightly, and walked to the front. Swore in. Took his seat. The prosecutor was young but direct. Mr. Yazzie, how did you come to discover the well? Mateo told it straight. No embellishment, just the facts. The cracked slab, the journal, the map, the discovery. He spoke with the steady rhythm of a man who had rehearsed it in his head every night for months. When they showed the photo of Tomas Aguilar, the room quieted. When they showed the ring, someone gasped softly. Then came the defense. Austin's lead attorney stood all confidence and cold charm. He paced slowly as he spoke. Mr. Yazzie, are you aware that your claim to the land in question is relatively recent? I am. So you weren't alive when the alleged events took place. No one here was, Matteo replied calmly. But you base your statements on a journal written by a man who, by your own admission, feared for his life. You expect the court to believe this without independent verification. Matteo didn't blink. The court already has verification. His bones, in the ground, under a slab poured by Elijah Coleman's company. The lawyer flinched. Matteo leaned forward slightly, and Thomas wasn't afraid of being wrong. He was afraid of being silenced. Silence stretched long. The judge nodded. Proceed. When Matteo stepped down, Lena stood before they could even call her name. She walked up with her head high, face calm, eyes focused on the judge. Not the lawyers, not the audience, not even the press huddled near the door. Ms. Yazzie, the prosecutor, began. You assisted your father in the investigation. Is that right? Yes. What motivated you to keep going? She paused, then answered. Because I was angry, at him, at the world, but mostly at how easy it is to forget people like Thomas. People like my grandparents who worked this land and never asked for more than what they were owed. Her voice didn't waver. We found letters Thomas wrote. He wasn't just trying to prove something. He was trying to leave a record so someone else could finish what he couldn't. The prosecutor handed her the journal. She opened it, read a short passage aloud. Thomas's words about land, about trust, about the way truth waits even when no one's listening. When she looked up, the courtroom was still. Austin's lawyer rose, but Lena didn't give him a chance to control the room. You want to ask if I'm sure, she said. If I believe what's in here. The judge raised an eyebrow. Lena held the journal up. I do. Because the bones don't lie. The letters don't lie. And the only reason it took 70 years to find them is because men with power buried them. She sat down without being dismissed, and the judge let her. The hearing ended just before noon. The judge called for a review panel and a grand jury recommendation. It wasn't the final verdict, but it was movement, the right kind. Outside the courthouse, the press swarmed. Cameras clicked. Reporters shoved microphones. Do you think the Colemans will be indicted? Do you fear retaliation? Will you press for reparations? Lena answered with a single sentence. We're not here for revenge. We're here so no one else gets buried and forgotten. Matteo stood beside her hand, resting lightly on her back. She didn't need him to speak for her anymore. Back at the ranch, the sun dipped low behind the ridge, lighting the valley in gold. They walked the field together, quiet, stepping along the edge of the pasture where Thomas once worked, where the ground had kept his secrets. A letter waited in the mailbox, from the Attorney General's office. Inside a formal statement, an inquiry into widespread fraud linked to Coleman Land and Water was now open. Federal investigators were joining the probe. Matteo folded the letter, tucked it into his pocket. No celebration. Just the weight of what came next. You ready? He asked. Lena nodded. Always. The wind carried the scent of juniper and old soil. The land had spoken. Now it was their turn to answer. Some legacies are passed down through blood. Others are dug out of the dirt with bare hands and a spine that won't bend. It rained the night before the final hearing. Hard-driving rain that hadn't touched Dawson Ridge in months. It turned the dirt road into a slick mess, ran rivulets down the sides of the hills, and soaked the survey markers near the well site until the flags flapped like torn prayers. Matteo stood at the window, watching the storm in silence, the same way Thomas once might have stood waiting for rain that never came. Lena was asleep on the couch, a folder of printed articles fanned out across her lap. News reports, court transcripts, Teresa Lucero's latest exposé. The land was quiet, but it didn't feel at peace. Not yet. At dawn, the rain stopped. The sky opened with a strange kind of clarity, as if the storm had scraped off months of dust and memory. The ridge glowed under soft morning light, and the air smelled like cedar and wet stone. Matteo stepped outside, boots sinking into damp earth. He walked the field where the first cattle once grazed the line of old fence posts, where he and Lena found Thomas's map. The boards they'd replaced still held his hammer marks. Rough, uneven, but solid. He stopped at the base of the well, now covered in a protective tarp and surrounded by caution tape. A plaque had been ordered. Teresa told him a memorial that would read Tomas Aguilar. The land remembered him. The words weren't fancy, just right. Lena joined him without speaking, arms folded tight against the wind. She was dressed for the hearing, dark slacks, clean shirt, the same earrings from her mother, her hair pulled back in a way that made her look older than she was. "We ready?" she asked. "As we'll ever be," Matteo said. They drove into town as the roads began to dry. This time the courthouse was packed. Reporters lined the stairs, local ranchers filled the benches inside, and 3 rows of Coleman employees sat stiff in the back, their expressions carved from stone. Austin Coleman stood with his attorneys, dressed in a muted gray suit, his tie loose around the neck. He looked tired, but not defeated. Not yet. The grand jury's findings had led to a federal investigation. Indictments were pending. Today's hearing wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about freezing corporate assets, transferring water rights, and determining state protection for what remained of the Aguilar property. It was about whether the truth would be preserved. Rebecca Chen was already at the front, briefcase open, her calm steady in contrast to the low murmur of the crowd. When the judge entered the room, rose as one. The quiet that followed wasn't solemn, it was thick with tension. First came the motions, then the evidence recap. Then Matteo was called again, not to testify, but to deliver final remarks on behalf of the landholders, the aggrieved parties, as the court called them. He stood slowly. His knee ached from old injuries, but he didn't let it show. He looked out at the room, at Austin, at the reporters, at the state officials, and then at Lena. "I didn't come here looking for justice," he began. "I came here looking for peace." A pause. The room held its breath. "My father used to say, land don't belong to people. People belong to land. And if you take care of it, it'll remember you. And if you don't, it remembers that too." He turned toward the judge. Tomas Aguilar took care of it. He worked it, mapped it, built his life on it. And someone tried to erase that life, not just his body, but everything he left behind. He held up the deed, the journal, a faded photograph of Thomas standing in the field with Rosalia. But the land didn't forget. It gave him back to us. He stepped down without waiting to be excused. The judge looked at Lena next. "You have anything to add, Miss Yazzie?" She rose. "Only this. If we let them bury this again, if we let fear or wealth or silence decide whose life mattered, we're no better than the ones who poured that concrete." She looked directly at Austin. "Some things don't stay buried. Not if enough of us remember." The judge nodded, then turned to her bench. The decision came 30 minutes later. A freeze on Coleman Land and Water's assets related to water rights. A state declaration to preserve the Aguilar Ranch as a historical and environmental site. And the transfer of mineral rights and groundwater ownership to the current deed holder, Matteo Yazzie. It wasn't the end, but it was the start of something new. Outside, Teresa Lucero waited with her cameraman. "You think this will change anything?" she asked as they stepped down the courthouse stairs. Matteo looked out at the sky. "It already has." Lena held up the court papers. Now the land belongs to someone who won't sell it out from under people. Teresa smiled. Then I guess it's time we tell the whole story. As the crowd began to break apart, an older man approached slowly, hat in hand, boots caked in red mud. You the folks who found him? He asked. Mateo nodded. Yes, sir. The man extended a weathered hand. Name's Saul Torres. I knew Thomas. He was my neighbor. I was 12 when he went missing. He looked down at the photo Lena held. I prayed someone would find him. You did more than that. Mateo shook his hand. We just listened. Saul's voice cracked. That's more than anyone did back then. They watched him walk away, shoulders lighter. Later that evening, the family gathered by the well. Rebecca joined them. So did Rosalia, helped along by her niece. She brought fresh flowers, wild sunflowers wrapped in twine. Lena helped her place them beside the marker beneath the open sky. They said nothing for a long while. Finally, Rosalia whispered. He waited long enough. Mateo looked across the land, the hills, the trees, the house now weathered, but still standing. He's home, he said, and for the first time in years, the wind didn't sound like mourning. It sounded like memory. Healing doesn't come all at once, it comes in pieces, a fence mended, a name cleared, a silence finally broken. The first real snow came early that year, surprising the ridge with a clean hush that blanketed the earth. The fields around the ranch shimmered in the white morning light, broken only by deer tracks and the faint outline of the trail Thomas once rode every week to town. Inside the house, the air smelled of cedar wood and coffee. Mateo stood at the stove flipping blue corn pancakes, wearing the same apron his mother once wore during harvest seasons. Lena sat at the table, her laptop open, fingers dancing over the keyboard. She wasn't just writing anymore. She was archiving, organizing letters, voice memos, scanned documents, maps, putting together the full record of Tomás Aguilar, not just his death, but his life, his work, his voice. I added the original survey maps to the archive, she said, sipping from a chipped mug, the ones he hand-labeled with elevations. Mateo nodded, focused on the skillet. Add the journal pages with the water tables. That's what first caught the attention of the engineers. They're already there. The ranch had changed since the court hearings. The well was now permanently marked and sealed, not with concrete this time, but with tempered glass and iron, its mouth visible, its story protected. A museum team was scheduled to visit in spring to assess the site for long-term preservation. But the real change was quieter, slower. Neighboring families who once kept their distance now stopped by. They brought cornbread, dried chilies, tools. They talked about the old days, about Thomas, about justice. Many of them had suspected something was wrong all those years ago, but had felt too poor, too powerless, too scared to speak. The silence had cracked open. Even the land felt different. Rain had come in regular spurts after the hearing, almost as if the sky had finally exhaled. The arroyo filled again. Deer returned to the lower pasture, and Lena, without saying it aloud, started sketching a plan for replanting heirloom seeds along the fence line. A mix of native grasses and wildflowers, what her great-grandparents once sowed. She closed her laptop and stood. I'm going to check on the lower gate. Mateo looked up. Take the rifle. Coyotes are moving closer since the snow. Lena smirked. I'm not scared of coyotes. Still. She grabbed the rifle from the rack, slung it across her back like it belonged there. Mateo watched her go, boots crunching softly on the porch steps, disappearing into the white light. He turned back to the stove, flipped the last pancake, and plated it carefully. Outside, the wind was slow and dry. Nothing sharp in it now, just the steady hush of winter waking up. At the county archive in Las Vegas, Teresa Lucero stood with her editor boxes of printed articles stacked beside them. She handed over a bound collection labeled The Aguilar Papers, Land Legacy and Silence. "It's all in there," she said. "The court records, the audio interviews, the aerial maps before and after the false permits." The editor flipped through it, whistling low. "You just made state history, maybe national." "It's not about that," Teresa replied. No, she said. "It's about one man who believed the land told the truth, and another man who listened." She left the archive and drove east where the snow gave way to thawing ground and wide blue skies. Her final story was already scheduled for publication the next week. The title had come to her at dusk while rereading Thomas's final letter. The Land Remembers. Lena reached the lower gate around mid-morning. The frost was already melting, sun winking through the fence rails. She checked the hinges, tightened a bolt, and brushed snow off the latch. Footprints came from the far woods. Not deer, not rabbit. Human. She followed them slowly, hand near the rifle strap, until she saw the man ahead, lean middle-aged, brown coat-knitted cap. He wasn't moving toward the house. He was kneeling at a small rock outcrop just above the place where Thomas used to pray. She didn't speak. The man stood after a moment, brushing snow from his knees. He turned and met her eyes. "You must be his people," he said. "Aguilars." Lena nodded cautiously. "And you are. My father was a field hand here, back before the war. Tomas gave him work when no one else would, gave him dignity." She studied him. "You knew him, only stories," he said. "But they mattered. Enough for me to drive 5 hours just to say thank you." He looked out over the ridge. "You've done something rare here. You brought a man home." Lena didn't know what to say. She just nodded. Before he left, the man bent down and placed a feather on the rock. "Let the land keep this too." Then he turned and walked away, his footprints softening behind him. That night, the fire burned low in the hearth. Mateo sat in the old chair with his boots off. Lena curled up on the couch, reading aloud from one of Tomas's final entries. "There will come a day when the bones will speak. And if you're reading this, it means the silence has ended. Take care of her, the land, the truth. She's all we have." Mateo's eyes didn't leave the flames. He wrote like he knew someone would finish it. He said. He hoped, Lena replied. Hope's all he had left. Mateo looked at her. Not anymore. Spring would come eventually. The court would finalize the ownership transfer. The state would recognize the site. The Colemans would face their charges, and the headlines would fade. But the story wouldn't. Not here. Because now when the wind moved over the ridge, it didn't just carry dust. It carried a name, and that was enough. The educational lesson learned from this story is that truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of rising when people have the courage to listen and act. It reminds us that land carries memory, and justice, though often delayed, can still find its place with persistence and heart. For those who've lived long enough to see promises broken, this story says your voice, your history still matters. Sometimes healing begins by simply refusing to forget.